At the Institute for Market Transformation, we envision a world where buildings dramatically lower greenhouse gas emissions and support our physical, social, and economic well-being. We build policies and advance business practices that enable people to build and operate healthy, high-performing buildings. We're actively working with more than 60 city, county, and state governments across the country, as well as national real estate leaders and community-based organizations. Buildings are not just the places in which we live, work, and play, but they also play a critical role in supporting our communities. In the context of carbon and cities, I want to talk about why we should care about building performance, how public policy drives progress, and the tough questions that we need to ask via research and in real-world practice to change business as usual so that buildings benefit us all. Today, the impacts of climate change are all around us. In my own town of Washington, D.C., flash floods inundated buildings and floated cars down streets last month. When I think about the role of our buildings in our cities, I think about the people I care about. My friend Sheila has a heart condition that makes her susceptible to heat and humidity, and her husband Brian is recovering from a bad case of COVID-19. They live in a home without air conditioning that's susceptible to flooding. So the question I ask myself is, do they have access to buildings that will protect them today? We need to design buildings for performance with a situational understanding of the changing impact of climate and with an eye to flexibility as our human needs change. We need to construct them to last, and we need to operate and renovate them with attention to carbon and resource efficiency, as well as occupant health, comfort, and productivity. Architects play a vital role in creating healthy, high-performing buildings. You're the visionaries that bring project goals to life and often oversee and manage all of the project's other design consultants. The leadership, guidance, and creative problem-solving skills of architects play a particularly valuable role in actualizing high-performing buildings. But often I hear from architects that your work is responsive to what the client wants you to do. So even if you know how to design the best building from a climate perspective or community perspective, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what gets built or operated. That's why at IMT we focus on widespread market transformation. A critical component of activating buildings to their fullest potential is driving demand for high performance. This can happen because building developers or owners want it, an investor demands it, a client like a tenant or buyer demands it, or because government policy requires it. My focus today is on developments underway in public policy that will influence demand for high-performing buildings. More than 30 cities have building performance policies today, and there's growing need for building performance policies to meet ambitious city carbon goals. 160 cities have pledged to be powered by renewable energy, and about 200 cities have plans to achieve substantial carbon reductions by mid-century. Public policy around buildings has evolved over time to support our evolving needs. Zoning laws drive the way that we plan for and use land. What we build and where we build it has implications for exposure to local climate risks and also carbon intensity of how we use our buildings. Building codes that were established around health and safety evolved in the 70s to include energy and water codes in an era of focusing on what we put into buildings to drive performance. In the 1990s, market leadership in clean energy programs surfaced concepts around carbon and health performance in our buildings. Over the last 20 years, building performance policies such as energy benchmarking and transparency policies, net zero codes, and policies that require upgrades to systems gained traction, in part because of the work of IMT. Now, I would argue that we're entering an era of integrated climate and social building performance, and there are new trends in policy development accordingly. One of the emerging policy tools in US cities addresses building performance more comprehensively and sets standards for performance with flexibility based on what makes sense in the community. The intention is to improve performance over all the buildings in a city. This has implications for buildings that are already standing as well as new buildings, as the buildings we design and build today can quickly become obsolete without care. The first building performance standard was adopted in 2018, and 4 have been adopted so far. We're actively working with a dozen additional cities and states building on this framework. The standards could include considerations for multiple measures, including energy, like site energy use intensity, carbon, water use, health measures like indoor air quality. And they can be designed to prioritize upgrades supporting climate resilience or to prioritize investments in building sectors where improvements will most benefit society. City governments are looking at these flexible standards as a way to advance social priorities as well, looking at ways to advance affordability, for example. A few of my IMT colleagues recently published a paper looking at how to improve buildings under a building performance standard while maintaining affordability in housing. Another trend in policy is towards involving the people who are most affected by a challenge in the policy design process. In the context of building performance standards, this includes people who experience unhealthy buildings or live in polluted neighborhoods, renters, and also members of the industry who can affect how buildings are designed and constructed. So given these trends and policies, the key questions I want to pose to this community for research and in practice address how we ensure that buildings perform to the level we need them to. What is or should be the architect's role in ensuring high levels of ongoing building performance? What are the most important measures of building performance? Many measures have been offered in leadership frameworks like LEED, WELL, FitWell, and Passive House. What measures do you think matter most and should be applied to the policies that are under design today? And finally, what are the business opportunities for architects as we increase building renovations across the country? It's great to be here with you today, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and join all of you and my colleagues today for a conversation about climate change, climate mitigation, and cities. I want to cover today the idea of a carbon economy or an economic lens through which we can understand cities, buildings, and land use. And we'll start with a fundamental question, which is, are cities America's carbon saviors from which we can draw upon as a matter of orientation for our future built environment? Is it really about cities, and in what regard? Well, if we think about cities, and we think about the great distribution here by carbon footprint and population, we see a great variety of footprints from which we can begin our global benchmarking. But indeed, New York, which we would think in domestic terms as being the highest order of carbon economy or carbon efficiency, if you will, is a little bit of an outlier, as it seems. Indeed, when you look at New York, it barely breaks the top 100 cities in terms of its underlying carbon footprint. It actually rests somewhere or comparable to suburban Connecticut and Arizona, which I think would be surprising to many of us, that New York's carbon footprint would actually be comparatively so high. You think of it as its city as this kind of machine from which there's an underlying efficiency that we can replicate and duplicate. Well, a little bit of this is skewed in the idea of Scope 3 emissions, those indirect emissions associated with economic output. And here, if we think about those Scope 3 emissions, it's actually skewing our perspective. So when we think about New York's role within a broader global economy, and we include those Scope 3 emissions, then it's actually masking a little bit of those underlying effectiveness or efficiency associated with minimizing or having a marginal or small carbon footprint. When we think about the United States and we think about energy intensity nonetheless, we see the legacy economies or the legacy component of the built environment in settlement patterns in the Midwest and the Northeast, and that would be anticipated by some measure to have parity with economic output. But then when what we see in terms of GHG intensity, we see it's actually not necessarily about economic output, and these are slightly different measures here between Scope 1 and 2 and Scope 3 emissions. But nonetheless, what we see here is a difference in lifestyle and a difference in settlement patterns that are largely attributable to land use, as I would argue at the end of the day. And in fact, when we look between Los Angeles and Boston, we actually see quite distinct aspects from which the mean is quite distinctive. in the sense that Los Angeles actually has a lower carbon footprint than does Boston. And I think that would surprise many people who think about the nature of car use and the suburbanization. But what we really see here is that it's the suburban land uses and housing land uses that actually change the mean. It's the wealthy suburban areas that actually further skew the underlying efficiencies of our carbon footprint. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind. So the proposition that I'll make today is that land use is the most economically efficient way to address climate change. The upside, of course, is that it's truly scalable, and that we have all of these other co-benefits of ecosystem services. The downside, of course, is that there's a scarcity, or when there may be a scarcity of land attributable or an outcome associated with our interventions in the name of climate mitigation, that undermines affordability of housing in particular. Well, when we add up, in this case, the top 5 sectors, the sort of low-hanging fruit of policies that going forward, this is the work of Hal Harvey, we see land use at about 15%, we see buildings. Well, land use is here including both ag and a number of other sectoral components. But when you sort of get down into land use, you see that land use, or urban land use more precisely, and that interventions in that realm are at least as effective as the low-hanging policy interventions that we could have in buildings. And I think it's something critically important to give consideration to for architects, urban designers, planners, and other professionals. When we think about the scope of global land use, indeed, the built environment is only 1% of total ice-free land surfaces. When we look at the aggregation or disaggregation across the United States, we see the predominance of certainly a meat economy, but an agricultural economy, and we see, as represented in the Northeast, a relatively small proportion associated with urban housing and urban and commercialization, as well as a pretty large area, or equal measure of area or opportunity is what I see it, for rural housing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ex-urban to urban divide is one that must be transcended in a country of cities necessarily, but I think that there are some opportunities here. For architecture, I think it's about electrification. I think about the idea of lifestyle shaping consumer preferences. Certainly, there's a discourse that I hope that we have today between high tech and low tech. But ultimately, as a matter of land use, it comes down to the maturity of suburbs. It comes down to infill development. And we can think about that infill development as an opportunity in an architectural practice for a greater diversity of typology. In this case, the missing middle of housing, which I think is a critical component of environmental design, that actually has a variety of other co-benefits in terms of accessibility of transportation, healthcare, any number of other things that accommodate these greater densities. And of course, TOD is the ultimate holy grail of urban land use. Here we see North American cities, as measured in gigajoules per capita per year, really standing out by virtue of our car, the car economy that we have, for a lack of better terms. So where does this all boil down to? It boils down to an opportunity for merging land use through zoning regulation and merging that with building regulation. So there's a carrot there, and the carrot is that we set up EUI, energy intensity benchmarking, and we use that benchmarking perhaps for bulk bonuses that reward increasing marginal utilities in the energy or underlying carbon footprint associated with buildings. So there's means to stimulate or incentivize activity in investment sustainability. But I think at the end of the day, it's really about sticks. It's about disclosure and reporting of greenhouse gas or carbon equivalency in buildings. As we see, for instance, in Local Law 97, but fundamentally at the end of the day, it's about a price on carbon. There's no two ways around it. And I think the price on carbon has to be incorporated in life cycle analysis from an architectural design point of view, and it has to be incorporated within greater and broader measures of land use. This is the only way that we can fundamentally address climate change and climate mitigation in the built environment. It's a combination of price on carbon. It's about environmental technology, and it's fundamentally about land use. These are the 3 pillars from which we have an opportunity to address the climate crisis that we live within. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this conference. I'm really glad that it's called carbon and not energy. I've been wondering lately why myself and others focus so much on the word energy, when in buildings and cities, what we care about saving is not really energy in and of itself. It's greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon dioxide equivalent, or it's utility cost savings, or it's the health effects due to burning fossil fuels. So I wonder why we don't have different metrics, why we aren't focusing on these things directly. I also have been wondering, why do we use energy use intensity so much, myself included, which is the energy use per unit of floor area. So we can consider these two images. Which building is more energy efficient? Well, according to that metric, it would be the one on the right. But then again, we don't build buildings for enclosing space, we build buildings for people. So my team was wondering what would be a better metric to use. And in this project, we were ranking buildings by energy use intensity, and these were residence halls. You can see the rankings on the right. Then we also ranked them by EUI per person and per person day, and the rankings totally changed. So if you were a building owner, at first you might think that building N was your worst performing building, but then it turns out that it was a completely different building. So what would be a better metric of ineffective energy use? Well, I don't have all the answers, but we thought of one idea. And it's based on this situation that I really hate, which is when it's summertime and it's hot outside, but you're freezing in your office, or the opposite in winter, where the only way that you can achieve comfort is by opening your window. So we suggested, why don't we use overheating and overcooling degree days, which simply uses indoor and outdoor temperature, two things that are easily measured, to calculate the duration and severity of energy used to overshoot comfort conditions. I'm also a fan of the saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that we need more triage for buildings and cities. We need more temperature and blood pressure checks, those cheap and quick methods to find problems worthy of further attention. And in my work, I've been trying to develop these tests. I'm also a fan of energy policies for existing buildings, like those that were passed in New York and DC. Even though I'm not a policy expert, these policies that focus on energy buildings, despite the fact that they may use energy use intensity, because let's face it, it is hard to find more information about the occupancy and the hours of use, etc. But I do think that this kind of move of having these policies is trying to focus us on the biggest slices of the carbon pie, and that's important. Here's a project that we worked on. In my group, we've been building on the work of Joe Allen and others at the Harvard School of Public Health to focus on the co-benefits of energy savings in buildings. So when considering building upgrades, especially at the policy level, instead of focusing entirely on utility cost savings, we should also quantify the social cost of carbon and the health benefits from reduced pollution emissions. We tested this for building energy efficiency upgrades in 10 US cities. And according to our estimates, the climate and health benefits may account for an additional 42 to 44% of the direct utility savings on average. We also, in this paper, tried to quantify the health impacts of reduced indoor temperatures in heat waves, especially for the most vulnerable populations who may not have air conditioning. Although we were not able to yet quantify those health-related cost savings, we do think that this is an important aspect to consider in the future, especially as heat waves become more intense and more frequent. While we're on the topic of co-benefits, in this paper, we were also thinking that benefits of building improvements should also include reduced urban heat island effect, due to the fact that in a better building, my air conditioning isn't dumping as much heat into the city, and therefore it's not contributing as much to the urban heat island effect. So we're working on a paper now demonstrating how we might calculate this. In this project, we wanted to improve the way we design windows by first finding a method to produce photorealistic views from virtually any fictional window, and then taking into account the building geometry, including energy performance features such as overhangs and fins, which I know sometimes they're great performance features, but architects can be nervous that they might block an important view. So this would help designers find that out. Next step would be helping the user to define a view score so that the view quality could be automatically quantified, which is important because it allows view to become a part of a parametric simulation process, along with other important performance factors that affect carbon, like greenhouse gas emissions and energy costs, and daylight performance. In this way, designers can know the important trends before even putting pen to paper, like rotating your building within 15 degrees of due south might not have much impact for daylighting and carbon, but for view, perhaps anything beyond 7 degrees would help significantly. So these are the kind of trends that I think it would be important for users to understand before starting to design. I want to talk about one last project because the findings so far are so alarming. What will happen to our existing building stock in future climates? We would never build a New York-style wall in North Carolina. But what will happen when, in the future, New York becomes more North Carolina-like? This is to say nothing of climate shocks such as leaks due to intense storm events, flooding, or storm surges, which we also expect to happen with climate change, but we're ignoring those effects right now. So our existing walls often include a vapor retarder. In cold climates, these were meant to prevent warm, moist air in winter from migrating into the wall cavity and condensing on the cold surfaces. What happens inside these walls on hot, air-conditioned summer days today? The opposite happens. The warm, moist air migrates from the outside, is exposed to cold surfaces, and is trapped without any means to dry to the inside. We hypothesized, and indeed our simulations showed, that this is occurring today. But the temperatures are mild enough and the season short enough that any microscopic mold growth would typically die off by the next season. We wanted to test future conditions, so in our papers, we've done 4 steps. First, we've identified typical wall sections in different cities and different climates based on different historic building codes and census information on the building stock. We've morphed weather files to future climates using best practices, and we've used best practices for hygrothermal simulation, which is simulating moisture and heat flow through the building envelope. Then we've used mathematical mold growth models coming from other researchers who have done extensive laboratory tests, and we put that all together to get a mold growth index for different walls in future climates. So we tested and found widespread potential problems in ASHRAE climate zones 4A and 5A. So in the east, this is cities like New York City, DC, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, and Raleigh. So when will this happen? Well, there's a lot of uncertainty in our method, but in some cities, this could be coming as early as mid-century, is what's shown here. So what should we do about this? Well, for one thing, fund more research. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and we had not found any conversation about potential future mold growth due to just the temperature and humidity changes expected in future climates. And we think that this is an important topic that needs to be part of the climate resilience conversation. We also think that we need to update our building codes to be amenable to future climates and not maladaptive. What specifically should we do to this existing building stock? Well, we're still working on that, but one solution might be to add more outboard insulation outside of the stud cavity, which, by the way, would be a win-win situation because that would improve the thermal performance of the building and lead to less carbon emissions in operations. So thank you for listening. I just wanted to share a few projects that my team has been working on that I thought might spark a conversation. Thank you very much for your time.